Thank you, Udi. We will now turn to our final panel and discuss US policies in the Middle East. There is no doubt that the way the US operates in the region and outside the region has a huge impact on all the relevant actors, and specifically on Israel and Israel's security concerns. These are challenging times for the US administration. On the international front, there is Russia and the situation in Ukraine, China as a constant rival, Iran and the threat it poses to the stability of the region, directly and through its proxies, along with other problematic actors such as North Korea. All this while also facing internal difficulties, the continuation of the COVID pandemic and its impact on the economy, and other domestic, social, and political challenges. How does all this impact the US policy in the Middle East? To address this topic, we are honored and delighted to have with us two prominent experts who are long-standing friends of the Institute. Both combine practical experience and academic expertise. Ms. Dana Stroul is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. In this role, she leads the development of US Department of Defense policy and strategy for the entire region. She previously served in the Middle East Policy Office of the Secretary of Defense and as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Between 2018 and 2021, before rejoining the government, Dana was a fellow in the Washington Institute's program on Arab politics. Our second panelist, Ms. David Schenker, is the Taube Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of the program on Arab politics. He also served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense between the years 2002 to 2006, and then joined the Washington Institute for more than a decade, but returned to the government in June 2019 and served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. In this capacity, he was the principal Middle East advisor to the Secretary of State, overseeing the conduct of US policy and diplomacy in the region, and was involved in consolidating the Abraham Accords and in attempts to counter Iranian influence in the Middle East. In January 2021, he returned to the Washington Institute. So Dana and David, welcome. Much has been written about the shifts in US interests in the Middle East, which combined with the resource problem are leading the US to redirect its focus and military expenditure from the Middle East. Beyond the question whether this is indeed the case, the fact that this is the perception of the actors in this area is significant. Potential ramifications include the increase in Iran's impact in the region, and we hear of a growing number of meetings between Arab leaders and representatives of Iran. In addition, this could lead to greater influence in the region of other powers, such as Russia and China. Is this a concern of the administration? What is being done or should be done to offset the potential ramifications of such a shift? So please, Dana, if you could comment first.
Thanks so much. So before getting to perceptions, I do want to address the facts. And the facts are that the Pentagon just concluded a global posture review. And what it confirmed is that we will continue to maintain tens of thousands of forces across many bases all over the Middle East. And those forces in that posture underscores significant security cooperation, defense relationships, exercises led by US Central Command all the time. Now, you're right that there is a perception that the US desires to leave the region and is leaving the region. And then layered on top of that are views from many of our Arab partners that they should take matters into their own hand and open up their own information and diplomatic channels to Iran. So I'd say from a Biden administration perspective, first of all, talks that can de-escalate, avoid miscalculation, are not in and of themselves a problem. We actually support de-escalation, support diplomacy. I think the reality of what we're seeing now is that those talks are not delivering in terms of de-escalation by Iran, in terms of less Iranian aggression, less Iranian cultivation of attack UAVs, missile attacks, support to proxies and terrorist organizations across the region. So this is an area where the United States is going to have to continue to consult very closely with its partners and, of course, on a daily basis with Israel as we work to address these issues. When it comes to Russia and China, here's the thing. What the United States is not asking for across the region is for divorces or a zero-sum game where relationships with China and Russia mean less with the United States. But I think what's really unique and which we really emphasize with our partners in the region is the decades-long security cooperation, the investment in exercises, the complexity of our defense and security cooperation relationships mean that we have to have a very honest dialogue about categories of Russian or Chinese engagement, whether it's commercial, defense, research and development, that are problematic for the safety of US forces, defense technology, et cetera. That is an ongoing diplomatic effort, both in the Defense Department and across the US government.
Thank you, Dana. David, what is your perspective?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be with you today, and especially to be appearing with my good friend and an excellent former colleague, Dana. Listen, I agree with what Dana had said. There is a perception that we are leaving. I mean, we are a great power, a superpower, but we have other priorities. But that said, we still have enormous presence in the region militarily and diplomatically. But there is a trend that is unmistakable, that has changed over time, that there is now a larger Chinese and Russian presence in the region. It's becoming a multipolar world. The United States has not been particularly good at demonstrating just what it has brought to the region. So we have China, for example, that brought us the COVID virus and has been excelling at face mask diplomacy. And they tout their achievements quite well. But the United States has really underwritten so much more in that regard and in bringing vaccines to the region. We just aren't very good at taking credit for what we do. And we do more than any other country on the face of the earth. We are still present. I think it's up to us to tell our story of what we're doing, but also to take a leading role in pushing back on Iran. There is I think a perception that we are narrowly focused on this JCPOA, getting back into the nuclear deal, and this no doubt is a priority, but neither can we leave the region at the tender mercies of the hegemonic ambitions of Iran and not do anything about their support for all these incredibly destabilizing regional militia. We are there, but there is certainly a perception problem that we have to work to better address.
Thank you. And linking to that and more broadly, there is a concern that the US has lost part of its deterrence due to an evident lack of appetite to use force. And this isn't a new concern. It dates back several US administrations. But I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan has also led to fresh allegations that the US abandons its allies, does not do enough to protect those that have assisted it. How would you respond to these concerns? And more specifically, is this something that should also worry Israel in the long run? David, let's start with you.
Well, the accusation of the United States abandoning its allies goes well back before the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, you remember the Kurds in 1991 after the Gulf War. This is something that has dogged us for some time, but I don't believe it's actually true. And the issue of Afghanistan, I think smart people can agree about whether our continued presence was something that was ultimately going to achieve U.S. Policy goals or objectives. But how we did it, of course, I think undermined a lot of our credibility, and of course, leaving behind a lot of our partners there without getting them out. I do believe that there is a time and a place for the use of military force. And this administration, but certainly administrations prior to the Biden administration, have been more reticent in the aftermath of the Iraq invasion and the Afghanistan invasion to use this force. It's costly, you get entangled, and we're very good at getting in and harder to get out. But it is useful every now and then, as we saw from the Soleimani assassination. to demonstrate that we are willing to use force to put Iran and other bad actors on notice, that we are willing to do so. And this is a qualitative difference than perhaps going after Shiite militia that harass us in Iraq, going after them in Syria, for example. I think it's necessary to remind people that we will defend our interests, and whether that means periodically going after Iranians who harass, dangerously threatening U.S. vessels operating in international waters in the Persian Gulf. I think this is useful, but we are a country that wants to use all elements of national power. These days, we are more focused on using sanctions, the economic tool, but we have to be prepared, I think, to use them all when necessary.
So Dana, is the US administration ready to use force, for example, in the Iranian case or other cases when necessary?
Sure. So the first thing I want to do is respond to a really important point that David made, which is I think that our partners and allies in the Middle East are acutely aware of the discourse taking place in this country. You do have members of Congress and you do have an American public who's looking at the decades of investment in the Middle East and Afghanistan and asking questions about what that investment in blood and treasure got us. And so as elected officials, not of course myself, but President Biden and his national security cabinet have to think really carefully about how they articulate the case for using force to the American public, and in general, how we build on the really tremendous investments we have in the Middle East. So that's number one. Number two, I think the Biden administration has been pretty clear over the past year that it is willing to use force at a time and place of our choosing. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Middle East, I've seen it used 3 times. Once, very recently, self-defense strikes when our forces were being attacked in Syria, and 2 times last year, both in response to attacks. These were self-defense strikes, of course, but it demonstrates that when the Biden administration has used all other tools in the national security toolbox and then decides that in addition, it is in our interest to use military force, it does it, it consults with Congress, it talks about it publicly through press releases and to our partners and allies about why we used it. The other thing I want to point out here is that despite all of this discourse about the U.S. leaving, the U.S. not doing enough for its partners, what's really remarkable to me is that actually across multiple Democratic and Republican administrations for the past 20 years, what's a line of continuity is that U.S. forces have remained in the region, particularly in combat scenarios. Iraq is a great example, not only before 2011, but recently coming back into the region to support Iraqi security forces and Kurdish Peshmerga forces to fight Daesh, to fight ISIS. But they did it, American forces, through a global coalition. And the commitment to that global coalition started in the Obama administration, continued through the Trump administration, has been reaffirmed by the Biden administration. So this is combining all the elements, again, of national security power here, our diplomatic convening power, our willingness to use force not only to protect ourselves, but to support and defend our partners and shared interests in the region.
Thank you. So let's move to another point. And one major achievement of the former administration and of you, David, was the normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab and Muslim countries. What is this administration doing to strengthen these agreements, as well as to encourage additional countries to forge official ties with Israel? So Dana, if you could start.
Thanks. So first of all, of course, tremendous credit goes to David and the previous administration for the incredible work and strategic vision they had to not only seize the opportunity, but to work with our partners in the Middle East for these normalization agreements. It has the potential to be the major strategic game changer for the region, not only in demonstrating that there is unity across the Middle East and countering Iran's destabilizing activities, but also when it comes to the civilian sector. So tourism, business, commerce, agriculture, education, the opportunities are just endless. And the Biden administration has been pretty firm about this. It seeks to strengthen existing normalization agreements and expand them to other countries. Now, from the Department of Defense perspective, because I'm here in the Pentagon, of course, the other really important decision and announcement made by the Trump administration was that Israel was going to move from the European Combatant Command into the central command, so US CENTCOM. And here, of course, the opportunities are just tremendous in integrating Israel into regional exercises, liaison relationships, conferences, all of the different opportunities for us here to use the platform of defense services to build those ties between militaries in the region, again, is us building on that really important initiatives.
The Biden administration puts much more focus on respect for human rights, adherence to international law, in comparison to the previous administration. But the question is, how does this strategy fit in the Middle East? One suggestion I read that was recently made by Stephen Cook from CFR is that President Biden has adopted a strategy of ruthless pragmatism, which can be seen, for example, in the acceptance of President Bashar al-Assad remaining in office in Syria and in the continued support to Saudi Arabia, despite its problematic record on human rights. Do you think, and David, you'll go first, is this indeed a correct description of the strategy of the current administration? And if not, what is the current strategy on these topics? So David, please.
Listen, I think we've heard from Brett McGurk, the senior director for the Middle East. He calls it getting back to basics. I don't know what to call it. I think in many ways it's continuity from the Trump administration Middle East policy. There is more talk about human rights, perhaps, but with the exception of Egypt, where some money was withheld, and the president's, I think, clear disdain for MBS in Saudi Arabia, I think that the policy is roughly the same. This administration has done the same thing about Saudi Arabia. It continues to provide them with defensive weapons to help protect themselves. It recognizes the importance of the alliance. But other areas, I think clearly the withdrawal from Afghanistan is not a win for human rights for about half the population, particularly being women. Listen, I think that there is a sort of pragmatism insofar as the administration, I think, understands that we have limited bandwidth. Every new administration comes in and says, compared to the last, that they could walk and chew gum at the same time. And they find out that it's quite hard to manage all the crises. And what the area that Dana's working on, what I worked on when I was in government, is a region of the world where there are more failed and failing states per capita than any other state, any other geographic region in the US government in the world. So it's incredibly difficult. And I think in some cases, we're hearing that there's going to be a more limited agenda. I think the last administration, the Trump administration, said, hey, we're going to push to get the UN Security Council resolutions implemented on political transition in Syria. Whether that was possible or not, we're not hearing a lot of that now. There's grudging recognition of normalization of some states moving forward with reestablishing ties, a less ambitious agenda there. But yeah, I think it's a somewhat of a recognition that there's only so much that can be done and a prioritization. But I think it looks a lot like the last administration. I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the administration's talk about human rights. I think it's fairly typical of the last 5 years of government.
So I'll respond there and say, first of all, in terms of continuity with the last administration, I think the continuity is investment and value and commitment to this part of the region, and particularly to our longstanding partners. I think what's different is that when you see a Biden administration official take a trip, make a phone call, make a statement, give a speech, you can rest assured that that is the outcome of a deliberative, intense interagency process, and it has the support of the president. So what you don't see in this administration is policy by tweet or policy by WhatsApp or something like that. When it comes to back to basics, and we're talking about human rights, I think here's the thing. What David said about instability in this part of the world, the big youth bulge, the demography, the lack of economic equity, et cetera, these are recipes for instability. countries and societies that don't have space for civil society, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, et cetera, are less stable. So human rights is about stability, and stable partners make better partners. And so what you see with the administration here is a commitment to continue to engage with this. Now, while it might not be public all the time, rest assured that human rights are certainly part of the agenda. And part of it not being public is a recognition that if we're having these difficult, uncomfortable conversations, sometimes they're better off in private. Now, in terms of the president's disdain for Saudi Arabia or something like that, again, I'm just going to offer, he sent his national security advisor to Saudi Arabia to meet with the crown prince. And that's a recognition of the importance of this partnership, the fact that Saudi Arabia is under intense attacks from Iran-backed Houthis, et cetera. And so this actually is walking and chewing gum. It's both supporting our partners, supporting them with defensive capabilities, early warning, et cetera, so that the Saudis are actually intercepting 90% of Houthi attacks against it. And at the same time, having honest discussions with them about the areas that we think make them unstable or vulnerable to criticism. Part of that also is responsiveness to Congress. So members of Congress are quite clear that they want human rights to be part of the agenda. And of course, this isn't unique to Saudi Arabia. It's across the region.
So let me move on to an arena closer home here to Israel, and also connected maybe a little bit to our previous question. If Israel finds itself in an armed conflict in the northern front against Hezbollah, there is a fear that Israeli airstrikes will lead to massive casualties and to destruction of property on the Lebanese side because of the entrenchment of the rocket launchers and military infrastructure amidst civilian concentrations. Will Israel be able to rely on US support even in such a scenario? Or could internal political pressure in the US, especially from the more progressive side of the Democratic Party, influence the way the administration handles such a situation? Dana, please.
Sure. So being a representative from the Pentagon, I'm not going to comment about the politics of the Democratic caucus or something like that. But I will say that from the Department of Defense perspective, we take our support for Israel and our support for Israeli defense incredibly seriously. Number one. And number two, an indication about the fact that there should be no doubt about the Biden administration's commitment to supporting Israel in a northern war type scenario is what you saw last year during the Gaza conflict. And what you saw is, despite intense international criticism of certain Israeli actions in Gaza, you saw no daylight from the White House, no daylight from the Pentagon. In fact, I sat through, I don't know how many calls between Minister of Defense Gantz and Secretary Austin, because it was both personally important to him and as a matter of the Pentagon to make sure that we were consulting about Israeli assessments of the state of the conflict, making sure Israel had what she needed to defend herself, and also consulting about the method of those operations. So those consultations and talking about civilian casualties, damage to civilian infrastructure, et cetera, always continue. They happen between the Israel and United States all the time. I would expect them to continue. But when it comes to a scenario in which Hezbollah, who's been able to massively arm itself and embed those precision-guided munitions in civilian areas, the United States is going to stand up for its partner and make sure that Israel has what she needs to defend herself and restore security and stability on the northern border.
Thank you. David?
I think Dana's just right here. I think this administration appears committed to Israel, demonstrated that back in Gaza. And I think there is a recognition, whether it is a Republican or a Democratic administration in power here in Washington, that a recognition of what Hezbollah is, and the threat of their not only arsenal, but the upgrading of the arsenal through the precision guided munitions project, and the threat to Israeli security. I think there's consensus, and that goes, it's bipartisan. It goes across the aisle in Congress. Now, there are certain political concerns because of certain elements of the of Congress, but I think it still remains, Israel remains a bipartisan issue, and particularly the issue of the threat of Hezbollah and Iranian proxies to Israel. So I think there will be broad American support and administration support for Israel. Nobody wants to see this happen, but I think given the the trajectory and as well as commitment to attaining these capabilities, I fear that we're headed down a path that will ultimately lead to some sort of conflagration.
Thank you. So let's turn to the Palestinian issue and or more generally also to the US-Israel relations with this government. And I was wondering, to what extent do internal political constraints on the Israeli government, namely the very delicate balance between right and left in this government, to what extent do they impact the demands of the US administration vis-a-vis Israel? For example, regarding the Palestinian issue, is this something that impacts these demands and the relationship? And maybe, and I know it's a little bit a sensitive question, especially for the officials on this panel. So David, maybe you can start, and Dana, I would like to hear your opinion too, if possible. But David.
Well, my view, and I'm not in the administration, so I can actually say it, it's the last thing the Biden administration wants to do is topple an Israeli government and, potentially bring back the Netanyahu administration. And so they've been, I think, very sensitive about pushing Israel on certain issues, including, but not limited to, the reestablishment of a Palestinian consulate or a U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem. This is something that has been mentioned, but doesn't appear to be, the administration doesn't appear to be pushing very hard because they understand how that could potentially shake an Israeli government. So I think in this case, you're seeing a less ambitious, at least publicly ambitious, administration effort to push on certain kinds of issues. And I frankly think, given the makeup of the Israeli government, I don't want to say instability, but the problems of forming a government in recent years, the number of elections, et cetera, that's warranted. I think there should be a certain sensitivity about that in the U.S. government. But overall, I mean, the relationship is solid. There appears to be great communication. And this is a strategic relationship. And so I think this administration seems to be handling this issue in a sensitive and appropriate way.
And I'll just add there, look, the art of diplomacy is recognizing the opportunities of the moment and what can be reasonably accomplished. So when it comes to the Palestinian issue, the Biden administration has been absolutely clear that it's committed to a two-state solution. Now, it also recognizes that the parties are not quite there at this moment in time. So a lot of focus has been how we can prepare to preserve opportunities for negotiations at some point in the future. When it comes to the specific makeup of the coalition government, as an executive branch official, we're going to work with whatever government the Israeli people elect and whatever that coalition is. From my perspective, the depth and consistency of consultations from the Netanyahu administration to the Bennett administration are the same. They're deep, they're constant, they're frank, forthcoming, and it's not just about consultation, it's about planning, cooperation, coordination, et cetera. Now, I don't know if you heard, but we have a new ambassador out in Israel, Ambassador Tom Nides. What I can see is that he is consulting with everybody, members of the Knesset, security officials, et cetera. And the importance of that is understanding all of the different perspectives in Israel and what the opportunities diplomatically are at this moment. We also have a fantastic U.S. security coordinator, Lieutenant General Mike Fentzel, who again is a 3-star flag officer committed to facilitating communication and doing what we can in support of an eventual two-state outcome. So those officials, to me, are a reflection of the Biden administration's commitment to these issues at this moment in time, and you're going to continue to see that level of senior leader investment and commitment.
Thank you very much. This has been fascinating. I wish we had more time. Thank you so much to both of you, and back to Udi for some concluding words. Thank you.